The morning of October 15, 1943, at Thorpe Abbotts Airfield in Norfolk, England, Ground Crew Chief Master Sergeant Daniel McCormick stood in the thin autumn light, watching a B-17 Flying Fortress make its approach. The aircraft's No. 3 engine was trailing black smoke. The starboard wing showed visible damage even from the ground. As it touched down and rolled to a stop, McCormick could see what 300 miles over enemy territory had done to her. The fuselage was perforated with holes, some the size of a fist, punched clean through the aluminum skin by 20mm cannon fire. The wings looked worse, sections of the trailing edge simply gone, torn away by flak fragments. The tail gunner's position had taken multiple hits, the plexiglass shattered, blood still visible on the interior framework. The tail gunner hadn't made it home. McCormick had seen this before. Every mission brought back aircraft that looked like they'd been fed through a cometer, threshing machine. But they came back. That was the important thing. Somehow, despite taking this punishment, they stayed in the air long enough to cross the channel and find an English field. He pulled out his damage assessment clipboard and began the familiar ritual. Each hole catalogued, each location noted. Wings, 17 major penetrations, uncountable smaller ones. Fuselage, 23 significant damage points. Tail section, 8 major hits. Engines, 2 minor strikes to the cowling, nothing critical. The pattern had become consistent across dozens of returning bombers. The wings and fuselage absorbed the most visible damage. The engines, by comparison, seemed almost untouched. To any reasonable observer, the conclusion wrote itself. Reinforce the areas taking the most hits. Put the limited armor where the bullets were clearly finding their targets. 300 miles away in Manhattan, a 41-year-old mathematician who had never flown in combat was about to prove that this reasonable conclusion would kill thousands of American airmen. His name was Abraham Wald, and he was about to ask a question that no one else had thought to ask. Where were the bombers that didn't come back? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe in 1943 existed in a state of crisis. The theory daylight precision bombing by heavily armed bombers flying in mutually defensive formations had seemed sound in peacetime planning. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator carried enough machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire. Flying in tight formation, the bombers would theoretically shred any fighter that attempted to attack. Reality had different ideas. The Luftwaffe fighter force, far from being intimidated by bomber formations, had developed tactics specifically to break them apart. Head-on attacks by Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, boring in through the formation's weakest arc of defensive fire. Twin-engine Messerschmitt 110s and Junkers 88s firing rockets from outside machine gun range. And everywhere, the Flak Flugabwehrkanone, anti-aircraft artillery, 88mm, 105mm, and 128mm guns positioned around every significant target and along known bomber routes. The numbers were becoming unsustainable. In the first 6 months of 1943, the 8th Air Force flew deeper into Germany, beyond the range of fighter escort. The result was catastrophic. On the Schweinfurt raid of October 14th, the same day, McCormick watched that damaged fortress limp home. The 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 seconds in a single mission. Not damaged, lost. Gone into German forests or the North Sea, taking their 10-man crews with them. Another 17 bombers were damaged beyond repair. 121 more required significant repairs. The human cost was even more stark. Over 600 men killed, wounded, or missing in one afternoon. The loss rate was nearly 20%, double what planning staffs considered the maximum acceptable threshold. For aircrews, the mathematics of survival was simple and terrible. In the early stages of the campaign, from 1942 through 1943, Only 35% of bomber crews completed their required 25 missions. 65% became casualties before reaching that number. If you were assigned to fly bombers for the 8th Air Force before D-Day, you faced a 77% chance of becoming a casualty. Killed in action, wounded, suffering mental breakdown, or dying in a training accident over England. The 8th Air Force would ultimately suffer more than 26,000 deaths, more than the entire United States Marine Corps, despite the Marines having deployed 100,000 more men. Every commander in the European theatre understood the crisis. They read the casualty reports. They visited the airfields and saw the empty bunks, the personal effects packed up and shipped home. They knew that the current trajectory was unsustainable. Something had to change. One obvious solution was armor. The bombers had some protective plating around the pilots' seats, around certain critical components, but not nearly enough. The limitation wasn't knowledge or manufacturing capacity, it was weight. Every pound of armor added to an aircraft reduced its bomb load, decreased its range, made it slower and less maneuverable. A bomber loaded with too much armor might not be able to take off with a full fuel load, or it might burn so much extra fuel that it couldn't reach the target and return. The question wasn't whether to add armor. It was where to add it. Where would limited protection make the most difference? The answer seemed to lie in the data the aircraft themselves were providing. Every bomber that returned from a mission carried evidence on its skin, a map of where enemy fire found its mark. Army Air Force's engineers began a systematic study. Examine every returning aircraft, catalogue every instance of damage, note the location, the apparent weapon type, the severity. From dozens, then hundreds of returning bombers, a clear pattern emerged. The damage wasn't evenly distributed. Certain areas of the aircraft took significantly more hits than others. The wings showed roughly twice as much damage as the engines. The fuselage was heavily scarred. The tail sections were repeatedly perforated. The interpretation seemed straightforward. These were the vulnerable areas. These were where the German fighters and flak batteries were successfully hitting American bombers. Logic dictated that armor should be concentrated in these frequently hit locations. Senior engineering officers prepared their recommendations. They calculated weight distributions, determined how much armor could be added to wings and fuselage without exceeding the aircraft's structural limits. They were preparing to issue modification orders to bomber groups across England. The only problem was that no one had asked the question Abraham Wald was about to ask. To understand why Wald saw what others missed, you have to understand the path that brought him to a classified research group in Manhattan in 1943. His journey had not been direct. Born on October 31st, 1902, in Kolosvar, Transylvania, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Wald grew up in a world about to be destroyed. His family was Jewish, deeply religious, traditional. The Hungarian school system required attendance on Saturdays, which the Wald family observed as Sabbath. Rather than compromise their faith, Wald's parents chose to homeschool their son until he was ready for university. They must have been exceptional teachers. Or perhaps their son was simply exceptional, probably both. By 1928, Wald had graduated from King Ferdinand I University with a degree in mathematics. By 1931, he held a doctorate from the University of Vienna. His mathematical capabilities were extraordinary. Colleagues would later describe his particular gift, the ability to look past the surface details of any problem and perceive the underlying mathematical structure, the universal skeleton that connected seemingly disparate questions. But in 1930s Austria, brilliance was not enough. The Austrian economy had collapsed. Political extremism was rising on all sides, and Wald was Jewish. Despite his credentials, despite his obvious abilities, university positions remained closed to him. He survived on a position created specifically for him by economist Oskar Morgenstern at the Austrian Institute for Economic Research, a temporary job that existed only because one decent man was willing to create it. For several years, Wald worked in economics, applying his mathematical skills to economic theory. He produced important work, but it was not the pure mathematics that truly engaged him. And always, the political situation grew worse. Then, on March 12, 1938, German troops crossed into Austria. The Anschluss, the annexation, was complete within a day. What had been discrimination became persecution. Jewish professors were expelled from universities. Jewish professionals lost their positions. Jewish businesses were destroyed. The violence escalated daily. Wold had received an offer from the Cowles Commission for Research in Economics in Colorado. He had been reluctant to accept. Taking the position would mean committing himself to applied economics, moving further from pure mathematics. It would mean leaving Europe, possibly forever. The Anschluss made the decision for him. By September 1938, Wold was in the United States, a fellow of the Carnegie Corporation at Columbia University in New York. He was learning English, adapting to a new country, studying modern statistical methods under Harold Hotelling. In 1941, he was appointed to the Columbia faculty. His emigration, forced by circumstances he hadn't chosen, had placed him in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, America's universities mobilized for war. The model had been established in the First World War and refined since. Academic expertise applied to military problems, physicists and engineers to develop new weapons, chemists to improve explosives and fuels, and mathematicians, statisticians, specifically to help make sense of the overwhelming complexity of modern industrial warfare. In late 1942, the National Defense Research Committee established the Applied Mathematics Panel to contract mathematical research for military applications. One of the panel's key groups was the Statistical Research Group at Columbia University, directed by W. Allen Wallace. The SRG was, in Wallace's own words, the most extraordinary group of statisticians ever organized, taking into account both number and quality. The roster read like a future who's who of American statistics and economics. Frederick Mosteller, who would go on to found Harvard's statistics department. Leonard Jimmy Savage, pioneer of decision theory and Bayesian statistics, a man almost completely blind, able to see only from one corner of one eye, who once lived for 6 months on nothing but pemmican to prove a point about Arctic survival. Milton Friedman, future Nobel laureate in economics, often found himself the fourth smartest person in the room. The smartest person in the room was usually Abraham Wold. The SRG operated from apartments at 401 West 118th Street in Morningside Heights, just a block from Columbia's main campus. To anyone walking past, it looked like just another residential building in a city full of them. Inside, the atmosphere combined the intellectual intensity of an academic department with the urgency of wartime deadlines. Next door, Columbia's contribution to the Manhattan Project was developing methods for uranium isotope separation. Down the hall, young women bent over Marchant desktop calculators, computing optimal fighter plane pursuit curves. In another apartment, Princeton researchers worked on strategic bombing protocols. The problems that came to the SRG varied enormously. Jack Wolfowitz optimized ammunition loading sequences for fighter aircraft, determining which types of rounds should be loaded in what order to maximize combat effectiveness. Abe Gershick developed sampling inspection procedures for Navy rockets, allowing quality control without testing every single rocket produced. Others worked on convoy tactics, submarine detection patterns, weapons testing protocols. The work was classified, the problems were urgent, and the stakes were measured in American lives saved or lost. There was a bureaucratic absurdity to Wold's position that everyone recognized but tried not to discuss. As a Hungarian national, he was technically an enemy alien. Hungary had joined the Axis powers. This meant he was legally prohibited from accessing classified information. Yet the military needed his mathematical expertise for classified problems. The solution was both pragmatic and darkly comic. There was a joke suggestion that each page Wald wrote should be immediately confiscated and never shown to him again. The actual solution was that a federal court fast-tracked his naturalization hearing, months ahead of schedule. America needed his mind more than it needed its own bureaucratic rules. In 1943, the Navy came to the SRG with what appeared to be a straightforward problem. Aircraft returning from missions over Europe were taking heavy damage. The Navy and Army Air Forces wanted to add armor to protect crews and critical systems. But armor was heavy, and aircraft had strict weight limitations. The question was simple. Given limited armor weight, where should it be placed to maximize aircraft survivability? The Navy brought data, detailed assessments of returning bombers showing the distribution of bullet holes and shrapnel damage. The damage patterns were clear and consistent. Wings showed extensive damage. Fuselage sections were heavily hit. Tail assemblies were repeatedly perforated. Engines, by comparison, showed relatively little damage. The Navy's question to the SRG was essentially an optimization problem. Calculate the ideal distribution of limited armor across these different areas to minimize total losses. Most of the group began working on the calculations. They were good mathematicians. They understood optimization theory. They started building models to balance armor weight against aircraft performance, calculating trade-offs between protection and operational capability. Abraham Wald looked at the same data and saw something entirely different. He saw an absence. The fundamental insight that Wald brought to the problem was deceptively simple, yet it required a complete inversion of perspective. Everyone else was asking, "Where are these bombers getting hit?" Wald asked, "Where are the bombers we're not seeing getting hit?" The distinction seemed subtle. It was revolutionary. Every diagram the Navy had presented, every bullet hole they had catalogued, every instance of damage they had documented, all of it came from aircraft that had successfully returned to base. These were survivors. By definition, they represented aircraft that could sustain damage and continue flying. The damage patterns on returning bombers didn't show you where aircraft were most vulnerable. They showed you where aircraft were least vulnerable, the places they could afford to be hit and still make it home. But what about the bombers that didn't return? The ones shot down over Germany, lost in enemy territory where their wreckage couldn't be examined. The ones that went into the North Sea or English Channel, sinking before rescue could arrive. The ones that exploded in mid-air when something critical was hit, scattering across European farmland in pieces too small to recover. Those aircraft weren't in the data. They couldn't be studied. Their damage patterns were unknown. Their absence was itself evidence. Wald understood something that the military engineers, focused on the data in front of them, had missed. They were looking at a biased sample. The sample of returning aircraft was biased towards survivability. It was selected specifically for the characteristic of having survived. Any conclusions drawn from this sample would necessarily be skewed. Consider it this way. If you examine 1,000 returning bombers and find their wings riddled with bullet holes, what does that tell you? It tells you that a bomber can take extensive wing damage and still fly. The wings are resilient. They can be perforated. They can lose chunks of their structure, and the aircraft will still generate enough lift to stay airborne and return to England. But if you examine those same 1,000 returning bombers and find very little engine damage, that doesn't mean the engines aren't being hit. The enemy isn't carefully avoiding the engines while riddling everything else with bullets. What it means is that when engines are hit, the bombers don't come home, they go down. They end up in the missing column, not the damaged column. The pattern of damage on surviving aircraft showed you where aircraft could tolerate damage. The absence of damage in certain areas showed you where damage was catastrophic. Wald didn't just present this insight as an observation. He formalized it mathematically. He developed a sophisticated statistical methodology to estimate the damage distribution for all aircraft, both those that returned and those that were lost. He divided the aircraft into distinct zones: engines, fuselage, fuel system, cockpit, wings, tail assembly. For each zone, he calculated the conditional probability of survival given a hit to that location. His assumptions were carefully constructed. He assumed that German fighters and flak batteries weren't selectively targeting certain areas, that hits were roughly uniformly distributed across the aircraft's profile during combat. This was a reasonable assumption given experimental evidence and the chaotic nature of aerial combat. German pilots were trying to hit the bomber, period. They weren't precisely aiming for wings versus engines in the split seconds they had while diving through a defensive formation. Given that assumption, the mathematical logic became clear. If hits were roughly uniform, but returning aircraft showed disproportionately few hits to engines and fuel systems, then aircraft hit in those areas had a much lower probability of returning. The absence of engine damage in the sample wasn't because engines weren't being hit. It was because aircraft with engine damage didn't make it into the sample. Wald's mathematical framework allowed him to estimate the survival probability for hits to each zone. The results confirmed what his intuition had suggested. Hits to the wings, fuselage and tail sections had relatively high survival probabilities. Hits to the engines, fuel systems and cockpit had very low survival probabilities. The armor needed to go where the bullet holes weren't. The recommendation must have been difficult for military planners to accept. It contradicted the obvious evidence. It required trusting a mathematical analysis over the physical reality of damaged aircraft sitting on the tarmac. It meant ignoring hundreds of documented instances of wing and fuselage damage to instead protect areas that appeared to need less protection. But to their credit, the military listened. They understood what Wald was showing them. They grasped that their data sample was biased, that they were only seeing half the picture, and that the invisible half contained the most critical information. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The recommendations were implemented rapidly. Armor reinforcement focused on protecting engines, fuel systems, and the cockpit area. Additional plating was installed around engine blocks to protect against small arms fire and shrapnel. Fuel tanks received improved protection, including self-sealing designs that could close small punctures. Pilot and co-pilot positions received enhanced armor, particularly around the seat backs and headrests. The visible damage pattern didn't change. Bombers still came back with wings that looked like Swiss cheese. Fuselages still showed dozens of penetrations, but more bombers came back. Crews that might have been lost when an engine took a critical hit instead made it home because the armor stopped the round before it penetrated vital engine components. Aircraft that would have exploded when tracer rounds ignited fuel tanks instead survived because the improved tank protection prevented catastrophic failure. The exact number of lives saved is impossible to calculate. You cannot count the men who didn't die. You cannot identify the specific missions where a crew survived because of armor that stopped a bullet that would have killed them. The mathematics of counterfactual history don't yield precise answers, but Wald's methodology wasn't used just for the rest of World War II. It was applied through the Korean War, through Vietnam. His framework for thinking about aircraft survivability, his understanding of survivorship bias, his methods for estimating damage patterns from incomplete data, all of it became foundational to the emerging field of operational research. The concept that Wald formalized survivorship bias extended far beyond aircraft damage assessment. It became recognized as a fundamental problem in data analysis, one that appears in countless contexts. Consider mutual fund performance. In 1996, a study by the Savant Research Group examined mutual fund returns and found that the average fund had returned 186% over the previous 15 years, an impressive 12.5% annually. But this figure included only funds that still existed in 1996. It excluded all the funds that had performed so poorly they'd been closed or merged into other funds to hide their failures. When researchers recalculated, including the dead funds, The return dropped to 134.5%, a more modest 8.9% annually. A comprehensive 2011 study covering nearly 5,000 funds found that the excess return rate of surviving funds was about 20% higher than the figure, including funds that didn't survive. Investors looking at mutual fund performance tables were seeing only the winners. The losers had been removed from the data. Consider entrepreneurship advice. Books about successful entrepreneurs study their habits, their decision-making processes, their risk tolerance. They identify common traits: willingness to take big risks, work long hours, persist despite setbacks. But for every entrepreneur who took big risks and succeeded, there are dozens who took identical risks and failed completely, losing their savings and going bankrupt. Those people don't get profiled in business books. Their habits aren't studied. The advice derived from studying only successful entrepreneurs is necessarily incomplete because it ignores all the people who followed the same strategies and failed. Consider military history itself. History is written by the victors, the saying goes. But it's more specific than that. History is written by the survivors, the soldiers, who made it home wrote memoirs. The units that survived intact preserved their records. The strategies that worked in the battles we won are documented and analyzed. But the soldiers who didn't make it home, the units that were destroyed, the strategies that failed catastrophically, their perspectives are necessarily underrepresented in the historical record. We see the bullet holes. We miss the planes that didn't come back. Wald's work during the war extended beyond the aircraft armor problem. He made fundamental contributions to sequential analysis, a statistical technique for analyzing data as it arrives, rather than waiting for a complete dataset. This work had immediate military applications in quality control and testing, but it became foundational to modern statistics. His book, Sequential Analysis, published in 1947, remained a standard reference for decades. He continued his academic work after the war, returning to pure mathematical research while maintaining connections to applied problems. His reputation grew. He was recognized as one of the most important statisticians of his generation. In 1950, the Indian government invited him to deliver a series of lectures across the country, recognizing his contributions to statistical methodology. On December 13, 1950, Abraham Wald and his wife Lucille were traveling from Calcutta to Bangalore. They were aboard Air India flight VT-CFK, a DC-3 aircraft, flying over southern India. The plane crashed near Rangaswamy Pillar in the northern part of the Nilgiri Mountains. There were no survivors. Wald was 48 years old. His wife was 43. Their two children, Robert and Betty, were back in the United States. They survived their parents. The irony is almost too painful to contemplate. A man who had saved thousands of aircrews, who had helped improve aircraft survivability across an entire war, died in a plane crash. Perhaps there's something grimly appropriate in it that his last journey was in service of teaching others, spreading the statistical methods and insights that had made such a difference. But mostly it's just tragic. The loss to statistics was profound. Wald's colleagues estimated that he was in the midst of his most productive period. Jerzy Neyman, defending Wald's work against criticism from Ronald Fisher the following year, emphasized Wald's contributions to the design of experiments and statistical decision theory. Lucien Lecam, in his own book on asymptotic methods in statistics, wrote, "The ideas and techniques used reflect first and foremost the influence of Abraham Wald's writings. Wald's son Robert became a distinguished physicist, making his own contributions to theoretical physics and general relativity at the University of Chicago. The father's mathematical insight and the son's physical insight, different fields, same fundamental drive to understand underlying structure. But the larger legacy extends beyond family and beyond academic statistics. The concept of survivorship bias that Wald formalized and applied has become part of how we think about evidence and inference. It's taught in statistics courses, business schools, medical schools. It appears in discussions of everything from clinical trials to startup advice to historical analysis. The core insight remains powerful. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but absence can itself be evidence. What you're not seeing might be the most important data point of all. Think back to Master Sergeant McCormick at Thorpe Abbot's airfield in October 1943, cataloguing the damage on returning bombers. He was doing his job carefully and conscientiously. He was documenting what he could observe. His data was accurate. His conclusions were logical. But he was only seeing half the picture. The bombers that landed safely, no matter how damaged, were survivors. They represented a biased sample. The truly vulnerable areas weren't the ones showing the most damage. They were the ones that, when hit, prevented aircraft from becoming part of the observable sample. Wald trained himself to see absence as data, to treat silence as signal, to ask not just, "What am I seeing?" but "What should I be seeing that I'm not?" This intellectual practice, this habit of looking for missing data, of questioning whether your sample is representative, of considering what might be hidden by selection bias, is perhaps Wald's deepest legacy. It's a form of disciplined skepticism that questions the obvious without dismissing it, that seeks to understand the structure of evidence itself before drawing conclusions from it. In the years after the war, as the full scope of 8th Air Force losses became clear through declassified records and historical research, the scale of the crisis that Wald had helped address became more apparent. The 8th Air Force had flown its first mission on August 17, 1942, 12 B-17 seconds attacking the marshalling yards at Rouen. They flew their last mission on May 8, 1945, 12 B-17 seconds dropping leaflets over Germany. In between were 986 missions. The loss rate varied dramatically over time. In the early missions of 1942 and 1943, before long-range fighter escorts were available, deep penetration missions into Germany suffered catastrophic losses. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, the mission that unfolded as McCormick watched damaged bombers return, lost 60 aircraft out of 291 dispatched, a loss rate over 20%. But as 1944 progressed, as P-51 Mustang fighters with extended range began escorting bombers deep into Germany, as improved tactics were developed, as aircraft survivability improvements were implemented, including Wald's armor recommendations, the loss rates declined. By 1945, 81% of aircrews completed their required 35 missions. The improvement wasn't solely due to armor placement. Many factors contributed: fighter escorts, improved formation tactics, declining Luftwaffe strength as German industry was degraded and fuel supplies were disrupted, better crew training, but armor improvements were part of the equation, and those improvements were based on Wald's insight about where to look for vulnerability. There's a memorial in Madingley, England, just outside Cambridge. The Cambridge American Cemetery holds the remains of 3,800 American military dead, most of them from the 8th Air Force. Another 5,000 names are recorded on the tablets of the missing men whose remains were never recovered or identified. Each name represents a son who didn't come home, a brother lost over Europe, a father who never got to meet his children. Walk through the cemetery's reflecting pool area, past the white crosses and stars of David in perfectly aligned rows, and you can almost feel the weight of the question Wald asked. How many of these men might have come home if we'd understood the data differently? How many names might not be on these tablets if we'd looked for the missing information instead of just cataloguing the visible damage? The answer is unknowable, but it's not zero. Wald's work represents something important about how humans interact with evidence. Our natural cognitive tendency is to focus on what's present, what's visible, what's in front of us. The bullet holes we can count, the damage we can see, the data points we have. This tendency is so strong that it takes active intellectual effort to counteract it, to ask, what am I not seeing? What data is missing? Is my sample biased? In the case of bomber damage assessment, The bias was literal survivorship. Only planes that survived could be examined. But survivorship bias appears in countless forms. Any time you select a sample based on a criterion that's related to the outcome you're studying, you risk bias. When you study successful people to learn success strategies, you're selecting based on success. When you evaluate treatment effectiveness by following up only with patients who return for checkups, you're selecting based on who didn't drop out or die. When you assess risk by studying past disasters, you're selecting based on what went catastrophically wrong, potentially missing near misses that were averted by good design or luck. The discipline Wald exemplified the statistical thinking that questions the completeness of data before drawing conclusions is more relevant than ever in an era of big data and machine learning. With vast datasets available, it's tempting to believe that more data necessarily means better conclusions. But if your data is systematically biased, having more of it just means you're more confidently wrong. Modern recommendation algorithms learn from user behavior, what people click on, what they watch, what they buy. But they only see the behavior of people who use the platform. They don't see the people who tried the service and left. They don't see the content that people would have wanted if they'd known it existed. The algorithm optimizes based on what it can observe, potentially missing what's most important. Clinical trials struggle with dropout. Patients who experience severe side effects or whose condition worsens may drop out of trials. If you analyze only the patients who completed the trial, you're looking at survivors, people who tolerated the treatment well enough to continue. Your conclusion about treatment effectiveness will be biased. Wald would have recognized these problems immediately. He would have asked, who's missing from your data? What systematic process selected your sample? What can you infer from absence? The evening of October 14th, 1943, after the returning bombers from the Schweinfurt raid had been counted, after the missing crews had been documented, after the damaged aircraft had been assessed, someone at 8th Air Force Headquarters had to compile the numbers and send them up the chain of command. 60 B-17 seconds lost, more than 600 casualties. Nearly 20% losses on a single mission. Somewhere in those numbers were data points that would eventually reach the Statistical Research Group at Columbia University. Damage reports, loss rates, the evidence that something was terribly wrong with current aircraft survivability. And in an apartment in Manhattan, Abraham Wald would look at those numbers and see not just the obvious crisis they represented, but the hidden information they contained. He would ask the question that changed how the military thought about protection. Where are the planes we're not seeing? It's tempting to tell this story as one of individual genius, the brilliant mathematician who saw what everyone else missed. There's truth in that. Wald was brilliant. His insight was genuinely revolutionary. But it's also a story about intellectual humility. Wald's genius wasn't just that he was smart enough to spot the bias. It was that he was disciplined enough to question whether the data he was seeing was complete. He assumed that his first interpretation might be wrong. He looked for structural problems in the evidence itself before trusting conclusions drawn from it. This intellectual humility, this assumption that there might be important information you're not seeing, is perhaps the most practical lesson of Wald's work. Not everyone has his mathematical gifts. But everyone can practice the discipline of asking, what's missing? What am I not seeing? Is this sample representative? In the end, Wald saved lives not by building better weapons or designing better armor, but by asking a better question. He changed the frame of the problem from, where are we seeing damage, to, where are planes with damage not surviving? That shift in perspective from studying the visible to inferring the invisible made all the difference. The bombers kept flying. The losses continued, though they gradually declined as fighter escorts improved and Luftwaffe strength eroded. The war ground on through 1944, through D-Day, through the liberation of Europe. And throughout it all, American bombers flew with armor placed where Abraham Wald's mathematics said it should be protecting the areas that seemed least damaged, because those were the areas where damage was fatal. How many crews made it home because of that decision? Impossible to say. But somewhere in the archives are mission reports that end with aircraft returned safely where, in a different world without Wald's insight, they would have ended with aircraft missing in action. Somewhere are men who grew old, who had children and grandchildren, who lived full lives, men who would have been names on the tablets of the missing if armor had been placed where the bullet holes were instead of where they weren't. They never knew Abraham Wald's name. He never knew theirs. But the connection existed, invisible and unbreakable. A mathematician in Manhattan asking the right question at the right time, and airmen over Europe benefiting from the answer. That's the profound irony at the heart of this story. The solution wasn't to repair what was obviously broken. It was to protect what only looked intact, because everything that broke there was already gone. The answer wasn't in the data everyone could see. It was in the absence everyone overlooked. Abraham Wald looked at bullet holes and saw missing planes. He looked at damaged wings and saw undamaged engines that had killed their crews. He looked at what survived and deduced what didn't. He saw the invisible evidence, and thousands of American airmen came home because he did. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.